This is History Myths and Myth Conceptions. And today's myth is no human sacrifices in Christianity. Christians like to emphasize that Christianity as a religion is fiercely against any kinds of human sacrifices. Sometimes they even claim that Christianity was instrumental in prohibition of this horrible practice that ancient polytheistic religions liked so much. And even though there are prominent depictions of human sacrifices in the religious texts of Christianity, they shouldn't be interpreted as such. There is a deeper meaning behind these depictions in the scriptures, and Christian churches strongly discourage any practices of this kind. None of the mainstream Christian denominations ever endorsed human sacrifices. All of this is not true. Christianity used to be one of the most active practitioners of human sacrifices we know of. And due to the special position Christian churches enjoyed and still enjoy in the Western world, there is a habit of looking at this problem from a different angle. In this video, we will briefly discuss three main aspects of human sacrifices in Christianity. First, the scriptures and the Christian mythology. Second, early Christianity. And third, sacrifices in a later, relatively well-documented period. Okay, the scriptures. But without going too much into the details, because although it is quite important, at the same time, it is not very relevant. Descriptions of human sacrifices in the scriptures are not the actual crimes of Christians. These are just descriptions, but they give you a certain context. So, very briefly, just some of the main examples. There is a human sacrifice in the center of Christianity, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ, which is frequently toned down because Jesus is considered not entirely a human. But it is a sacrifice, and it is a sacrifice of the firstborn son, so you can easily make parallels with ancient Semitic religions, like the Carthaginian cult of Baal Hamon. We're not gonna discuss right now why the omnipotent God sacrifices his son to himself, while being his own son at the same time, which, in a way, is sacrificing himself to himself. There are thousands of pages of religious literature covering this subject in the attempt to intellectualize and tone down the inherent stupidity of this concept. Now we are moving to the Old Testament. The binding of Isaac is the most famous depiction of human sacrifice there. God tells Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac. Abraham obeys. And it is a clear declaration of his righteousness. The angel stops the ritual, Isaac is replaced by the lamb, or maybe transformed into a lamb. It must be noted that there are Talmudic interpretations of this event, including, that Abraham actually killed Isaac, and later Isaac was resurrected. Or maybe not. This famous story is sometimes promoted as the only story of the sacrifice in the Old Testament. A sacrifice that never happened, because God is good and stuff like that. But no, this is not the only story. There are others. Jephthah, in the book of Judges, actually kills his daughter. Christians sometimes insist that it should be understood differently, that there was no sacrifice, although it is quite clear from the text that the sacrifice took place. Or that, there was a sacrifice, but it wasn't approved by the God, so it shouldn't be interpreted as a sacrifice. As we will see a bit later, this is not the only time when Christians refuse to accept that sacrifice is a sacrifice. There is apparently some interesting logic going on here. If you refuse to label a sacrifice as a sacrifice, it automatically stops being a sacrifice. Murder is not a murder if you don't like the guy. Also, she shouldn't have worn that dress. That kind of idea. Moving on. The Book of Kings. Hill of Bethel rebuilds Jericho. He laid its foundations at the cost of his firstborn son Abiram, and he set up its gates at the cost of his youngest son Segub. Definitely not a sacrifice, interpreted as a curse of Joshua, but in accordance with the word of the Lord. The Book of Numbers describes the genocide of Midianites and includes interesting phrases about the tribute for the Lord, sanctioned by the God himself, which can easily be understood as the ritual sacrifice of 32 captured human beings. Interesting stuff, wonderful books. Now to the early Christians. It is really hard to say anything specific about the early Christians, because we don't have any reliable information about them. Yeah, that may sound a bit weird if you hear this for the first time. The problem here is that everything we think we know about early Christianity comes pretty much exclusively from religious sources. The most important book here is the church history of Eusebius, attributed to the 4th century, attributed by the church. And since we don't have the unbroken transmission of historical knowledge, some people still don't know that, we cannot be sure who and when actually wrote these works of Eusebius or, say, Lactantius. It could have been done centuries later by random anonymous authors. It is hard to be sure that the audience ever read these books before they were printed. In a moment, you'll see why I'm discussing this subject in a video about human sacrifices. For traditional reasons, most of the historians accept the church attribution of Eusebius and other early Christian authors, although virtually all of the historians consider these works unreliable, especially Eusebius. The titles like The Church History confuse people a lot. These are not historical books. These are religious texts, and their primary purpose is the creation of mythology of the early church. They mention prominent priests and religious thinkers. Their existence is not verified by any non-church source. And they emphasize a prominent topic: the Christian martyrs and persecutions of Christians by the Roman authorities. Obviously, all these absolutely fantastic stories are not supported by any non-Christian sources, except maybe by a weird letter in Pliny the Younger or a wild and unbelievable anecdote from Tacitus about Nero and the Christians. But we're not discussing this right now. Now, you can treat the information about the persecutions as based on something, but just incredibly exaggerated by the Christian propaganda. Another way, less traditional and more radical, is to treat all of the early church histories and accounts as pure fiction and deliberate falsification of history. For the sake of argument, we will follow a more or less traditional way and imagine that the Roman authorities indeed persecuted Christians to some extent, at some point in time. What was their purpose? Roman religion was a polytheistic system that successfully integrated foreign cults. They couldn't care less about some small monotheistic sect, unless this sect is doing something outrageous. Christians can't give any logical reason for their persecutions. The only thing that approaches a reasonable explanation is this story that Christians refused to participate in the formal rites of Roman religion. But it doesn't hold much water, especially since it is believed that ancient Jews were exempt from all of this, and nobody really persecuted them on religious grounds. But it is true that generally very tolerant Romans sometimes could be very intolerant toward certain religious systems and suppress them when they could. If they were practicing something outrageous that Romans just absolutely hated. So Romans were really skeptical about the religion of Gauls, religion of Carthage, and they suppressed the cult of Bacchus. The main reason was human sacrifices. Christians actually like to accuse Romans of practicing human sacrifices, which might be true for the early legendary period of Roman history. But after that, no, they utterly despised them. In a way, if you believe in persecutions of Christians and look for the explanations, well, this is one of them. Obviously, it is a speculation, but a reasonable one. There are other interesting things in the religious works describing the imaginary history of early Christianity. I will name one more because it is very relevant to the thing we're discussing right now. The most famous early Christian martyr is Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna. Polycarp was burned at the stake, or as Eusebius tells us, with his hands behind him and bound like a noble ram taken from a great flock, an acceptable burnt offering unto God omnipotent. And just before he was burned alive, he said, among other things, "May I be received before you this day in a rich and acceptable sacrifice, as you, the faithful and true God, have beforehand prepared and revealed and have fulfilled." And now we can move from mythical early Christians to a more or less well-documented period of history. This is the period when Christians have enough political power to practice mass human sacrifices, which frequently include burning people alive at the stake. As you've probably guessed, we're talking about the Inquisition, and we're talking about the ceremony of auto da fe. Christians obviously refuse to recognize this as human sacrifices. But let's take a closer look. First of all, auto da fe literally means the act of faith. People sentenced to death on religious grounds were paraded during the elaborate religious ceremony. This ceremony also included prayers and singing of religious hymns. It attracted a lot of spectators and was held at some public space, quite frequently in front of a church. This sort of event was planned and carefully prepared beforehand. The executions took place during the Christian holiday or on Sundays. And then, in a ritualistic fashion, the victims were burned at the stake, like a burnt offering. When some non-Christian religion kills people during the ritual that involves priests, it is always called a human sacrifice. When Christians do absolutely the same, well, that's different. Somehow. If you don't explicitly call it a sacrifice, then it ceases to be a sacrifice. Except for that, apparently sometimes priests actually mentioned that it is done for the glory of the Lord. That's double standards, and that's juggling with words. People actually think that all of these horrors of the Inquisition is something medieval. No, that's not true. The last documented auto da fe in Europe happened in 1826. It is reported that outside of Europe, the last ceremony of this kind happened probably in Mexico around 1850. So yeah, Christians were practicing actual human sacrifices well into the 19th century. It is amusing that Christians have the audacity to say that Christianity is against human sacrifices, when they were ritually killing people during religious ceremonies in the not-so-distant past. Their scriptures have numerous references to human sacrifices, and their religion is built around the idea of a human sacrifice.